Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Let's get rolling. I wanted to touch on a subject that I discussed a while back, and that is my own background. Well, not just my background, but the background of many people in the United States and throughout the world, namely the background of being an Ashkenazi Jew. Now, by extension, that could also apply, I suppose, to Sephardi Jews, to Mizrahi Jews, and others, but I will only speak for Ashkenazi Jews since that is what my background is. And although I do not practice the religion of Judaism, I'm still Ashkenazi, and I am still from an Ashkenazi Jewish background. So I think I qualify to address the subject that I am about to address. Here it is. I am not white. No one should call themselves white. No one should call themselves white. Why? In the United States, and that's really all I'm talking about, that's all I really have direct knowledge and experience with. Whiteness was created on slave plantations. How? Well, generally speaking, what most historians believe is that on these plantations, you had three categories of people. First and foremost, you had the blue bloods, the plantation owners. They were the people who had the most power, the most influence, and obviously the most money on that plantation. Second, you had the slaves who were black, originally African. Then you had the rednecks, and they called themselves rednecks. That is not a disparaging term, or it is not originally a disparaging term. Outside of the South, especially outside of the Deep South, many people will use the word redneck as an insult. But having lived in the Deep South, namely having lived in Georgia for a total of 6 years and Mississippi for a total of 4 years, and having traveled around other parts of the Deep South, especially South Carolina, I have known a lot of people who called themselves rednecks. So, who are these rednecks? Rednecks these days are people who would be seen as being white. Many times they are people these days who are involved in the MAGA movement. Not all of them, of course, but many rednecks are supporters or members of, I guess members is maybe not the right word, supporters, advocates, whatever, of the Make America Great Again movement, inspired by former president and possible future president, we don't know, Donald J. Trump. Um, they generally like to hunt, to fish. They are commonly poor. They like country music. These are all generalities, of course. Um, they um, they don't really have much in terms of a living. They don't make much money. They often live in trailer parks. Um, they often take odd jobs when they can. Some of them may have very low paying, like working poor, or in some cases, working class type jobs, the bottom of the working class. But basically, they are simply poor people, poor white people. That's what the redneck is in the Deep South. So again, if you are in the Deep South The word redneck is not in the Deep South a disparaging term. It is seen as being positive. People identify themselves as being rednecks. I know because I've known a lot of people like that. I have had conversations with them. Many of them often will get involved with conspiracy theories like various forms of the uh, Illuminati conspiracy and others, because for the most part, rednecks are poorly educated. And with a lack of education comes a greater susceptibility to conspiracy theories because you are looking for a way of making sense out of the world, which is what we all really want to do, I suppose. But if you don't have sufficient education, book knowledge or book learning, then you are kind of vulnerable to picking up stuff from rumor, to believing in things that are simply not true, like the Pizzagate conspiracy, for example. There are a lot of rednecks and others as well who bought into the Pizzagate conspiracy and other conspiracy theories as well. So, on the plantation, you had these rednecks. They got the nickname redneck because, for an obvious reason, they were out in the sun and the backs of their necks got sunburned. That's the origin of the term. They worked side by side with the black slaves. Basically, they were in the same income bracket or the same wealth bracket or poverty bracket as the black slaves. Not much of a difference. Both of them, meaning the rednecks and the slaves, had a lot more in common with each other than either of them did with the blue bloods, the plantation owners. But here is what many historians say is that some of these owners of plantations approached certain rednecks with the proposition, we, meaning you and I, redneck and me, have a lot in common. We are both English and originally all quote unquote white people or of English ancestry. The slaves have none of those characteristics. They are not like us. They are not English. Their ancestry is from Africa. So we have a lot in common. So let's make a deal. Let's make a deal. And I'm not referring to the old TV show, and it may be on again. I remember the original version with Monty Hall. I know he's dead. I think somebody else replaced him. Maybe the show is still on. You'd probably know that more than me because I very rarely watch television. But in any event, let's make a deal. You, the redneck, will serve as a kind of foreman, a kind of supervisor for the slaves, keeping them in line. In exchange for that, we will pay you more wages. We will give you the right to represent yourselves in court. That was true. That the right to represent oneself in court was not guaranteed. And the blue bloods had a lot of power over that. We will give you the ability to own your own property. That was very significant because in the early years of the United States, owning property was a prerequisite for voting in U.S. elections. And if you are a poor person and somebody comes to you with that kind of deal, the chances are that you will accept it. You're not going to think about the moral implications of it. Most likely, you won't even recognize that there are any moral implications of it. You will simply think of yourself and your family and how this can benefit you and them. So, rumor spread that some of these blue bloods were making these deals, and pretty soon, other blue bloods, other plantation owners began doing the same thing. And before you know, on the plantations, you had three categories of people. I guess you could say three social classes: the blue bloods, the rednecks, and the slaves. That's the way the plantation was made up. Now, what happened when the plantation system eventually ended? What happens after that? The people who were most hurt by that were the rednecks, not the blue bloods. Many slaves continued living on the plantation. Whether they got paid, who knows? Maybe in some cases, yes, in some cases, no. But they saw themselves as being a part of the plantation owner's family. And many of them thought, well, I don't know where else to go. So they remained where they were. On the other hand, the rednecks lost the only source of power they had. That was the power over the black slaves. And so the KKK, lynchings, and other forms of bigotry and discrimination against African Americans was born. That was a result of the end of slavery in the United States. And even today, we see the residues, the remnants of that slave system existing in the United States. The killing of so many innocent black people by police officers, innocent people, for a long time before the police cams came online. Police officers would sometimes, I don't know how often, plant guns next to a black person and would say, well, I had to kill this individual. See, this individual had a gun. Meanwhile, the gun was put there by the police officer, and the cops got away with it for a long time. Even now, from time to time, those kinds of stories will arise where you'll see a police officer doing precisely that, even now in 2024. So the problem has not gone away. It is still very much with us in the 21st century. May have changed in some ways, but in many ways it is still very much the same as it was back then. Now, I look at my own family and I can see a parallel of sorts, not exactly, but of sorts. When my parents were growing up in New York City, as I did, my father was born in 1919. My mother was born in 1924 in the Bronx, my father in Brooklyn. They were not defined as being white. They were Jews. A white person was English. The Irish immigrants were also not white. The Russian immigrants, the Italian immigrants, the Polish immigrants, and so on, none of them were seen as being white. But because the Irish could speak English, they got the best jobs. And one of those jobs were police officers. And so in a lot of early movies, you will see people with Irish accents, actors with Irish accents as police officers. that was an actual reflection of the facts on the ground in the early part of the 20th century. The Italians and the Jews, on the other hand, were often looked down upon by the Irish. And the Italians and the Jews often hated the Irish in return. There was no love lost on either side. You would think that normally the Irish and the Italians would come together because both were Roman Catholic, but no, it was the Italians and the Jews who in New York City became allies, became friends, began to eat each other's food, began to intermarry. My late Uncle Ralph married an Italian woman, and they became Unitarian Universalists when they were trying to pick some religion to raise their children in. Eventually, for some reason, they got tired of it and left. My Uncle Ralph was also a communist. In fact, he was one of the communist organizers in the Bronx in New York City before he moved out to Los Angeles, when he eventually gave up communism, although he was, I think, enthusiastic when I told him that I was a communist. He kind of laughed, and I could tell expressed a kind of pride that I had become a communist. He found out that from me over the phone. And Ralph and I did not always get along very well, but in his elder years, we got along fine. In any event, after World War II, it was a totally different story. But let's step back a bit. My father told me the awful way that he and other Jewish soldiers were treated in the army. Now, my father was actually in the National Guard originally. He enlisted in the National Guard. Why, I have no idea, but that's my father. And when the bombing of Pearl Harbor took place, his battalion was transferred from the National Guard into the Army. And so my father served in the Army as a corporal eventually in the Philippines, Australia, and New Guinea. He told me one story which I found immensely depressing. I was very young when he told me this story. At that time, I had no idea that any of this went on. We lived in Jewish neighborhoods. All the people I knew were Jews, so I had no experience with this kind of stuff, but I was kind of grateful that he told me this because it was something I simply did not know, but I thought, well, I should know this. This is knowledge I should have. A soldier. I don't know what the ethnicity of the soldier was. I assume white. Walked up to my father and, in a perfectly serious manner of speaking, asked my father, "Please show me your horns." That was not a statement of mocking. That was not intentional discrimination. Well, it was discrimination, but not intentional discrimination. This person actually believed, as did many people, that Jews had horns, but they kept them hidden. And so this soldier wanted to see my father's horns. My father was astounded by it. He told me that he actually had a physical fight with the person. They broke out into a fist fight, whatever. I don't understand that, but my father obviously was angered by it. That makes some degree of sense. After World War II was over, all of a sudden, my father and my mother discovered that all of a sudden they were white. During World War II, you had Jews, Italians, Irish, Polish, etc., all serving in the army along with English or white people. And so the tent of whiteness became larger and began including people like my father. Now, my parents, like the rednecks, accepted that label of whiteness in a sense. They embraced it. They didn't resist it. They began thinking of themselves as white people. Would I have done that? I don't know. I can't talk about myself in a different timeline. I would hope not. Do I know? No, I can't know. All I can do is hope that I would not have done that, but whatever. I don't blame my parents. They didn't know. And so, yes, they accepted this new designation that suddenly they were no longer just Jewish. I mean, they were Jewish, but they were also white. So that kind of phenomenon is not unique to what the rednecks did. My parents did it as well, as did other ethnic minorities in the United States. Embrace this label of whiteness. And even today, there are people who debate how much should that label be expanded? For example, should we include Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, etc., in this category of whiteness? That debate has not ended. But one thing that is clear from all of this as a sociologist is that all of these categories are artificial. They are all social constructions of reality, meaning they are not objective realities. There is no such thing as whiteness or blackness or anything. We are all mutts, hybrids, whatever you want to call us, mongrels. None of us are purebreds. There is such a thing as a racial characteristic like eye color or hair color or blood type. And if you travel around the world, you will see different characteristic hair types, skin types, blood types in different parts of the world. Those are legitimate racial characteristics. But what have we done here in the US? We don't care about that. We don't care about blood types. We don't care about eye color. We don't care about hair color. We care about skin pigmentation. We care about the eye fold in certain people of Asian descent. And that's about it. We don't care about much else. We care about what protects the integrity of white people. So what would be the use of dividing white people by hair or by eyes? No, that wouldn't make any sense. So they're united. And so it's perfectly natural for a blonde-haired person to marry a brunette-haired person, or a blue-eyed person to marry a brown-eyed person. But it's less common, although more common than it was, for a black person and a white person to get married. Fortunately, it is happening more, but still not as much as with people of the same or different skin types and different hair types and different eye types, I should say. So basically, race is artificial. It doesn't exist. It is something that exists as a vehicle for supporting social class. It is a class identifier. Sociologist Herbert Gans used that term originally. He said that if race can no longer be an effective class identifier, then something else will need to replace it. Very interesting idea. I have no idea what that means or what would replace it, or if indeed anything will replace it. But it's a very interesting and provocative statement that race is a class identifier, or at least it has been in the past, maybe less so than it was. In other words, we have more Black people who are in the higher social classes right now than there was when I was a child. It was not common to see a Black person as an attorney or a medical doctor. Now it is. Okay, so let's get to the heart of what I wanted to really address. And that is me. Well, again, not just me, but people like me. My old dentist, back when I lived in Kansas, in the Kansas City area, the Kansas suburbs of Kansas City, Missouri, not Kansas City, Kansas. That was up to the north, but Kansas City, Missouri, about 20 minutes from where I lived. My dentist was a Palestinian from Gaza. And of course, I've talked about Gaza quite a bit in this podcast. If you've been watching it, when I first saw her, my first thought was, this person looks like an Ashkenazi Jew, like me. And she does. Same facial characteristics. In fact, if I didn't know any better, if she was not wearing a hijab, which she did, she wore a hijab, but if she were walking down the street without a hijab, my first thought would be, this is an Ashkenazi Jewish woman. There is a closeness, a genetic closeness between Palestinians and other Arabs as well, some other Arabs, not all, and Ashkenazi Jews. We are related. We are all a part of the same family. We are brethren or cousins or any other term you want to use. We are relatives. So you would expect us to look like one another. We are all Semites. We are all Semites, and other things don't really matter. You can talk about different lines of Semites, but we are still all Semites. And so when I looked at my dentist, who I eventually called by her first name, we became friends. I saw her as my sister. I treated her as my sister, not because of how she looked, but it's because I think of how she looked and how I looked that we became so close and we began to converse. We became really, really close friends. So, what is the result of that? Here it is. Race should be rejected. Whiteness should be rejected. Nobody, no person who is white, supposedly white, like supposedly, I guess I am white, or defined as such now, should say I am white. Now, if somebody else calls me that, I'm not going to make a fuss over it. No point. But I don't call myself white at all. I never call myself white. There's no point because I know where whiteness comes from. It comes from the slave plantations. That's the origin of whiteness. And I personally want no part of it. I do not want to participate in an activity which existed almost 200 years ago and more, which involved the oppression, the slavery, the captivity of other human beings. I don't. So I will never call myself whiteness. But what I will do, I will always acknowledge that I benefit from white privilege. To do otherwise, to me, would be grossly immoral because I do benefit from white privilege. If I were a black person, whatever black is, Barack Obama called himself black. His father was Kenyan. His mother, I think, was of English ancestry, an American from Kansas. And yet he chose to call himself black. Historically, in the United States, most people who have even a portion of African ancestry call themselves black. In Louisiana, if you were 1/16th black, you were black. In Virginia, it was 1/32nd black, and you were black. So that was not a compliment. That was a caste system. That was a racially based caste system saying, no, we will not let you out of it. So, no, I will not deny my white privilege. I realize I benefit from that. I realize that if I were seen as being a black person, that I would not get the treatment that I get. So I would never want to deny that. And in principle, I never will. But when I am asked to define myself, say on censuses or surveys or whatever, here is how I define myself. Now, some people will legitimately disagree with me, and that's fine. I define myself as a brown, Ashkenazi Jewish person of color. A brown, Ashkenazi Jewish person of color. That is specific. That way, it doesn't sound like, if I just said person of color, I could be accused, perhaps, by some people of appropriating blackness. Now, I don't think that is true, but some people might think so. So to avoid any hint that I might be doing that, I say that I am a brown, Ashkenazi Jewish person of color. And that is it. That is how I think of myself, while at the same time realizing that even that is a social construction. But it is a social construction which I can embrace over the horrible social construction of whiteness, which I oppose. Now, of course, I don't oppose white people. I try to get along with everyone, but I oppose calling myself a white person. And I don't think that anyone else should use that label. Now, what they should call themselves is none of my business. That is for them to decide for themselves. But for me, I am a brown, Ashkenazi Jewish, or in other words, Middle European Jewish person of color. We are Bund. We are Bund. We are Bund. This has been Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.